Her skin turned white in an instant. Leprosy. In front of everyone. The woman who had prophesied since childhood, who had led the victory dance at the Red Sea, who had been the voice of God among his people for 80 years, destroyed in a single moment. But her brother Aaron, who said the exact same words, walked away untouched. Why? That question has tormented scholars for 2,000 years, and the answer is far more disturbing than a simple act of divine justice. Her name was Miriam, the older sister of Moses, the woman who saved his life when he was a newborn, floating in a basket on the Nile. The book of Exodus calls her a prophetess before it even gives her a name. The prophet Micah, centuries later, would list her alongside Moses and Aaron as one of the 3 liberators God sent to free Israel from slavery. She didn't save her people with a sword. She saved them with a song, a tambourine, and a courage that cost her everything. But the moment she dared to question her brother's authority, her body became the sign of her punishment. And what followed was worse than the leprosy itself. Because after those 7 days of exile, after the healing, after the people welcomed her back into the camp, Miriam's voice vanished from Scripture. Completely. For the rest of the book of Numbers, until the day she died in the desert of Zin, the prophetess of Israel was condemned to silence. What you're about to discover is not just the story of a woman. It is the story of a hidden detail, a single word in chapter 12 of Numbers that changes everything we thought we knew about this episode. To understand it, we need to go far back, to a time when Israel was not yet a nation, but a family of slaves. To a child standing alone on the banks of the Nile, hiding behind the reeds. To a decision that would change the course of human history. To understand who Miriam was, you need to understand what it meant to be born in Egypt, under the Pharaoh who wanted to exterminate his own people. Her family belonged to the tribe of Levi, one of the 12 tribes descended from Jacob. Her father was Amram, her mother Jochebed. They were direct descendants of Levi, the 3rd son of Jacob, and that meant one thing. They were priests by birth, keepers of the religious traditions of a nation that existed only in memory. Because Israel, at that moment, was not a nation. It was a vast population of slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, building brick cities for a king who despised them. Miriam was the firstborn. Aaron would arrive years later. Moses, the last, would be born in a moment of absolute terror. But when Miriam opened her eyes for the first time, Egypt was still a livable place for the Hebrews. They were poor, oppressed, working from dawn until dusk under the whips of overseers. But they were alive. Their families were growing. Children were laughing in the streets of the Hebrew quarters of Goshen. Then something changed. Pharaoh, seeing that the Hebrew people were multiplying too fast, decided to take a drastic measure. He summoned the Hebrew midwives, the women who helped mothers give birth, and gave them a simple order. Every Hebrew boy born on the birthing table was to be killed immediately. Girls could live. Only males had to die. The midwives, 2 women named Shiphrah and Puah, disobeyed. They lied to Pharaoh's face. They told him that Hebrew women gave birth so quickly the babies were already born and hidden before they could arrive. Pharaoh, furious, escalated the cruelty. He issued a public decree. Every newborn Hebrew male was to be thrown into the Nile, drowned, disappeared, erased. Into this world Moses was born, and in this world Miriam, perhaps 6 years old, perhaps 7, watched her mother do the most desperate thing a woman can do. Jochebed took the newborn, hid him for 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she built a small ark of papyrus reeds. She waterproofed it with pitch and bitumen. She placed the baby inside, and she set it down among the reeds at the bank of the Nile River. Now pay attention to what happens next, because this is the first act of Miriam that the Bible records, and it reveals everything about who she was. The mother placed the basket in the water and walked away. She had no choice. A Hebrew woman watching over a specific spot on the Nile would have drawn attention. The Egyptian guards would have noticed. They would have arrested her, found the baby, and killed him before her eyes. So who remained to keep watch? A child, Miriam, alone among the crocodile-infested reeds of the Nile, in a country where owning a Hebrew newborn was a death sentence. She hid there for hours, perhaps an entire day, without moving, without crying, without being seen. And then the impossible happened. The daughter of Pharaoh himself, surrounded by her handmaidens, came down to the river to bathe. She spotted the basket floating among the tall papyrus reeds. She sent a servant to fetch it. She opened the lid, and she found herself looking at the face of a Hebrew newborn, crying. Any other Egyptian princess would have called the guards, would have thrown the baby into the Nile as her father had ordered. But this woman felt compassion, and in that precise instant, while the princess held a baby destined for death, a Hebrew child stepped out from the reeds. Miriam approached the princess of Egypt, and with an audacity that defies all logic for a child her age, she spoke. "Shall I go and call a Hebrew nurse to feed this baby for you?" The princess, surprised, accepted, and the child ran to call Jochebed, her own mother, who would now be paid by the royal palace of Egypt to nurse her own son. The baby that Pharaoh wanted dead was now growing up under the protection of Pharaoh's own daughter. All because of the intelligence of a 7-year-old girl who understood in an instant how to transform tragedy into salvation. This is the first time we meet Miriam in Scripture. She isn't even called by name in this passage. She's only the sister. But what she does is the first prophetic act of her life, because without her, Moses would have been an orphan raised in the Egyptian palace, far from his real mother, ignorant of his Hebrew origins. Without her, the liberator of Israel would never have known his own people, and there would have been no Exodus. 80 years passed. Think about that for a moment. Everything the Bible tells us between the rescue of Moses and the start of his mission unfolds across a span of time that could contain 4 generations. Moses grew up in the palace. He killed an Egyptian overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave. He fled to the desert of Midian. He married the daughter of a Midianite priest named Jethro. He had 2 sons. He shepherded sheep for 40 years. And then, on the rocky slopes of Mount Horeb, he saw a bush that burned without being consumed and heard the voice of God commanding him to return to Egypt. But Miriam, in all that time, the Bible is silent. It tells us nothing about her. We only know that when Moses returned to Egypt, Miriam was still alive. According to rabbinic tradition, based on the fact that Moses was 80 at the time of the Exodus and Miriam was several years older, she would have been around 86 or 87. She had spent her entire existence among her people, sharing the slavery, the hunger, the despair. The rabbis say that during those 80 years, Miriam continued to prophesy. She kept hope alive among the Hebrew women. She told them not to stop having children because the deliverer would come. And she knew. She had seen. She was the one who had saved the baby from the waters. When Moses returned, accompanied by Aaron, and when the 10 plagues struck Egypt one after another, Miriam was there. She watched the water of the Nile turn to blood. She saw the frogs invade the Egyptian houses. She witnessed the flies, the gnats, the pestilence on the cattle. She saw boils appear on the bodies of the oppressors. She watched hail destroy the harvests and locusts devour every blade of grass. She saw darkness fall upon Egypt for 3 full days. And then, on the night of Passover, she watched the angel of death pass over the Hebrew houses and take every Egyptian firstborn, including the son of Pharaoh. That night, the people walked out, 600,000 men of fighting age, plus women, children, elders, and a mixed multitude of non-Hebrews who joined them, perhaps 2 million people in total, marching toward the wilderness, toward freedom. But Pharaoh changed his mind. He sent his army to pursue them. War chariots, horses, trained soldiers. Israel found itself trapped between the Red Sea ahead and the most powerful army of the ancient world behind them. We know what happened next. Moses raised his staff over the crashing waves. The sea parted. Israel crossed on dry ground between walls of water. The Egyptians followed. The waters closed. The army of Pharaoh drowned. But what happened after that crossing is something the films never show you. The book of Exodus tells it in just 3 verses, and it changes everything about Miriam's legacy. Moses and the men of Israel sang a song of victory, one of the oldest poetic texts in the Bible, called the Song of the Sea. And then, while the men were still singing, something unexpected happened. The book of Exodus describes it simply. Miriam, the prophetess, sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dances. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." There is something in this passage that many readers pass over without seeing. For the first time in the Bible, a woman is called a prophetess. She is the first woman whom Scripture names with an official religious title. And she is not called sister of Moses, she is called sister of Aaron. This detail, according to many scholars, indicates that Miriam had her own autonomy, her own identity, her own authority. She was not the shadow of her famous brother. She was an independent religious figure. She was the voice of the Hebrew women. She was the prophetess of Israel. While Moses led the men in song, Miriam led the women. She pulled them out of the despair of slavery and brought them into the explosive joy of liberation. It was the women who started the dance on that seashore. It was the female tambourines that made the desert resound. And that song, those few surviving words, became one of the oldest and most venerated texts of the entire Hebrew tradition. In that moment, on the shore of the Red Sea, Miriam was at the height of her authority. 86 years old, she had witnessed the birth of a nation. She had led the dance of liberation. She was a prophetess, a leader, a spiritual guide. Before her stretched the wilderness, and she could not know, in that precise instant of triumph, that in that very wilderness she would lose everything: her voice, her honor, her skin, and finally, her life. But that catastrophe was still in the future. And before we get there, we need to understand the hidden role Miriam played during those 40 years of wandering. Because what the rabbis tell us about the well of Miriam changes the entire meaning of her story. For 40 years, Israel wandered in the wilderness. It was not a simple journey. It was an exhausting sequence of camps, marches, complaints, miracles, rebellions, and punishments. The book of Numbers lists 42 camps between Egypt and the land of Canaan, 42 times to take down the tents, load the carts, walk in the burning sun, and put it all back up again, for 2 million people, for 4 decades. During those years, 3 figures stood at the head of the people: Moses, the lawgiver, the supreme prophet who spoke with God face to face; Aaron, the high priest who wore the sacred garments, entered the tabernacle, and offered the sacrifices; And Miriam, the prophetess, the voice of the women, the singer of the people, the female presence that held together the half of Israel that the men tended to ignore. The rabbinic tradition tells a remarkable story about Miriam during those years. They say that every time the people made camp in the wilderness, a well of water miraculously sprang up. That well was called the Well of Miriam. According to the sages, it had been given to Israel in honor of the prophetess, as a reward for her courage on the bank of the Nile. For the entire duration of the journey, as long as Miriam remained alive, there would be water. For 2 million people, in a desert where water was more precious than gold. Think about what kind of authority is being attributed to this woman. Her very presence ensured the physical survival of the nation. Without Miriam, Israel would have died of thirst. And when her death comes, several chapters later, the first thing that happens is exactly this. The water disappears, the people rebel. Moses loses his patience, and he commits the mistake that will cost him the entrance into the promised land. Everything triggered by the death of his sister. But we're getting ahead of the story, because before the death, before the silence, before the lonely burial in the desert of Zin, there was the confrontation. The moment when Miriam, after decades of faithful service, decided the time had come to speak, and her words unleashed a catastrophe that no one saw coming. About a year after the exodus from Egypt, Israel was camped at a place called Hazeroth, along the route of the Sinai desert. Moses had received the law on Mount Sinai. The tabernacle had been built. Aaron had been consecrated as high priest. The nation was now an organized community with laws, priests, prophets, and a structure of governance. Everything seemed to be going well. Then, in the space of a few verses, the book of Numbers introduces an episode that changes everything. Chapter 12, verse 1. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. A Cushite woman? What does that mean? Moses had married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, priest of Midian, decades before. Had he taken a second wife? Was Zipporah herself Cushite? And what does the word Cushite even mean? This is one of the most debated mysteries in the entire Bible. The Hebrew word is Cushite. In Hebrew, Cush was the name given to the region that corresponds today to Ethiopia, Sudan, Nubia. It was sub-Saharan Africa, inhabited by people with dark skin. A Cushite woman was literally a black African woman. Some scholars believe this was Zipporah, and that Miriam used the term Cushite in a derogatory way because of her different ethnic origin. Others believe Moses had married a second woman, an Ethiopian princess, in a moment the scriptures never describe. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, told an extraordinary story about this. According to him, during his youth at Pharaoh's court, Moses commanded an Egyptian army in a campaign against the kingdom of Cush. During the siege of the capital, a Cushite princess named Tharbis fell in love with him from the city walls. She offered to surrender the city in exchange for marriage. Moses accepted. The city was spared. The princess became his wife. This tradition isn't in the Bible, but it was widespread in antiquity, and it would explain everything. Why the book of Numbers mentions a Cushite woman without further details, why Miriam reacted in that precise moment, and why God considered the criticism so dangerous. But the next verse reveals what the real problem was. They said, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken also through us?" There it is, the real issue. The Cushite woman was a pretext, a facade. What burned in the hearts of Miriam and Aaron was something else entirely. They were jealous. They thought they had been pushed into second place. They wanted recognition. They wanted the people to know that they too were prophets, that they too had the right to speak, that Moses was not the only channel through which God communicated, and there are reasons to believe that the criticism was at least partly legitimate. Aaron was the high priest. Miriam was a recognized prophetess since the Red Sea. The prophet Micah would confirm it centuries later without any ambiguity. Chapter 6, verse 4. I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, 3 liberators, 3 names, sent by God, all 3 of them. But something made the criticism of Miriam different from the exercise of legitimate authority. Something turned it into something dangerous in the eyes of God. And the answer is hidden in the Hebrew grammar of the text itself. Notice the order. Miriam and Aaron spoke. Miriam first, not Aaron, not the 2 together with equal weight. And in Hebrew, the verb to speak in this verse is conjugated in the feminine singular. Vatadaba. She spoke. Together with Aaron, yes, but she spoke first. She initiated the challenge. This grammatical detail reveals everything. Miriam was the mind. Miriam was the voice. Aaron followed her, perhaps persuaded, perhaps swept along. But the initiative was hers. And then the text inserts a surprising parenthesis. Chapter 12, verse 3. Now Moses was a very humble man, more than anyone else on the face of the earth. Why this sentence? Why here? Why in the middle of the conflict? The most convincing answer is this. Moses, hearing the criticism from his sister and brother, did not defend himself. He did not respond. He was too humble to fight back. And because he refused to defend himself, God intervened directly. Because when someone leaves judgment to God, they receive a defense more terrifying than any human word. And God's intervention came suddenly, without warning, without mercy. The Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, "Come out, the 3 of you, to the tent of meeting." A pillar of cloud descended at the entrance. The voice of God emerged from within, and that voice did not explain. It did not discuss. It thundered. "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in vision. I speak with him in dream. But not so my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. Mouth to mouth I speak with him, in vision and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The words are devastating. God is saying, yes, Miriam, you are a prophetess. Yes, Aaron, you are a prophet. But your kind of prophecy is dreams, visions, riddles, images you must interpret. Moses speaks with me directly. Face to face. Mouth to mouth. Without filters. He sees me. He hears me. He is different. He is unique. You dared to say you are like him. The cloud rose. Aaron turned toward his sister, and what he saw was the most horrible thing Hebrew law could conceive. Miriam had become leprous, white as snow. Leprosy in the Bible was not simply a disease. It was considered living death. The book of Leviticus establishes that whoever is struck by it must tear their garments, let their hair hang loose, cover their lips, and cry out to anyone who approaches, "Unclean, unclean." A leper had to live outside the camp, alone, exiled, considered already dead. Aaron looked at his sister, the woman who had been his companion for 80 years of slavery, the prophetess who had led the song at the Red Sea, and now she was rotting before his eyes. Something broke inside him. He turned to Moses. Not to God, to Moses, the brother they had just publicly challenged. and he uttered one of the most heartbreaking prayers in the entire Old Testament. "O my Lord, do not hold against us the sin we committed in our foolishness. Let her not be like a stillborn child, whose flesh is half consumed when it comes from the mother's womb." And Moses, faced with this scene, did not take revenge. He did not gloat. He did not remind them of what they had just said against him. He opened his mouth and cried out to God in a prayer that is only 5 words in Hebrew, and one of the most piercing lines in all of Scripture. El na refanala. Please God, please heal her. 5 words. From a brother who had just been publicly attacked, but who could not bear to watch his sister be destroyed. God answered. But it was not an immediate pardon. It was a measured sentence, a justice with a clock. If her father had spit in her face, would she not be ashamed for 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days. And after that, she will be brought back in. 7 days. An entire week of public shame. In front of all of Israel. In front of the women she had once led in dance on the shores of the Red Sea. In front of the priests who served under Aaron. In front of the children who had grown up hearing her songs. For an entire week, the prophetess of Israel walked out of the camp and sat in the desert, exposed to the sun and the freezing desert nights, waiting for her punishment to end. And here is one of the most remarkable details in this entire story. The people did not move forward. Israel did not take down their tents. They did not load the carts. They did not leave Hazeroth. For 7 full days, 2 million people waited. They waited for Miriam to be healed. They waited for their prophetess to be brought back. The book of Numbers states it plainly. The people did not move on until Miriam was brought back. The entire nation, with its wives, its children, its elderly, its animals, standing still in the wilderness for a week to honor the woman who had been punished. It was as if Israel was saying, "We do not go on without her. She is ours." The punishment of God had not been accompanied by a rejection of the people. On the contrary, the people stood still in silent solidarity with the fallen prophetess, and after those 7 days, she returned. But something after Hazeroth had changed forever, and what comes next is the part that almost nobody talks about, the part that reveals what really happened to Miriam in the years that followed, the part that is, in many ways, more painful than the leprosy itself. What happened to Miriam after the 7 days of exile is almost never told. Those who know this story usually stop here at the leprosy, the punishment, the prayer, and the healing. They think it ends with the prophetess brought back and everything returning to normal. But if you read the rest of the book of Numbers carefully, something terrible becomes clear. Miriam never speaks again, not once, for the rest of Scripture. Search for her name in the chapters that follow. Chapter 13, the episode of the spies sent to Canaan. Nothing. Chapter 14, the rebellion after the spies' report. Nothing. Chapter 16, the rebellion of Korah against Moses. Nothing. Chapter 17, the budding staff of Aaron. Nothing. Chapter 20. Finally, Miriam's name reappears. But in what context? The book of Numbers, chapter 20, verse 1. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel came into the desert of Zin in the 1st month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. And Miriam died there, and was buried there. That's it. 1 sentence. For the woman who saved Moses from the Nile, for the prophetess who led the song at the Red Sea, for the sister who had been a pillar of the liberation of Israel. 1 sentence, no details, no public mourning, no national grief, none of the elaborate funeral ceremonies the Bible describes for other major figures. Just, there Miriam died, and there she was buried. Now compare that with what happens later. When Aaron dies, the book of Numbers dedicates 11 verses to his death. It describes the ceremony in detail. Moses and his nephew Eleazar climbing Mount Hor, Aaron removing the priestly garments, Eleazar putting them on in his place, the descent from the mountain, the mourning of all Israel for 30 days. And when Moses dies, the book of Deuteronomy dedicates an entire final chapter. The climb up Mount Nebo, the vision of the promised land, his death on the mountain, the secret burial by God himself, the mourning of Israel for 30 days, and the closing line, "There has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." For Miriam, one line, then silence. But the book of Numbers, in an almost cruel way, continues immediately. Chapter 20, verse 2. There was no water for the congregation. For 40 years, according to tradition, there had been water because Miriam was alive. The well of Miriam. Wherever she went, water sprang from the earth, a silent miracle given in her honor. And the moment she died, the water disappeared. Her death is followed immediately by thirst, by desperation, by a people crying out because they have nothing to drink. And this is where Moses commits the most devastating mistake of his life. God tells him to speak to the rock, and water will flow. Moses, instead, exasperated, probably broken by the death of his sister, takes the staff and strikes the rock. Twice, with fury. And he shouts at the people, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock for you?" We, not God. We. Moses lost control. He lost his patience. He lost the humility that had always defined him, perhaps because his sister had just died, perhaps because the grief had shattered something inside him. And God said, "Because you did not trust me to sanctify me before the eyes of Israel, you will not bring this people into the land I have given them." Moses would never enter the promised land because of one act of anger. And that act happened in the exact moment his sister had been buried, as if her death triggered a chain reaction that would mark the end for all three siblings. Aaron dies months later. Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. The founding trio of Israel, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, all disappear by the end of the book of Numbers. None of them see the promised land. Now we can finally return to the fundamental question we suspended at the beginning. Why was Miriam punished? Why only her? Why did Aaron, who spoke exactly the same words, remain untouched? The rabbinic commentators have offered 4 explanations over 2,000 years of debate, and the fourth one, the one that most modern scholars prefer, is the most uncomfortable of all. The first explanation is grammatical. As we've seen, the verb in verse 1 is conjugated in the feminine singular. Vatadaber Miriam. She spoke. Even though Aaron is mentioned alongside her, the Hebrew text makes clear that she was the initiator. Aaron was the silent accomplice. The thought, the word, the action were hers. And in Jewish tradition, the one who initiates a sin is considered more guilty than the one who follows. The second explanation is structural. Aaron was the high priest. Striking the high priest with leprosy would have paralyzed the worship of the entire tabernacle. An impure priest cannot serve. The sacrifices would stop. The religious structure of Israel would collapse. For reasons of national stability, Aaron had to be spared the physical leprosy, even if he was not spared the inner shame of watching his sister punished in his place. The third explanation is theological. Miriam had spoken about the personal life of another person. Judaism considers slander, what they call lashon hara, the evil tongue, one of the gravest sins a person can commit. And the traditional punishment for slander is precisely leprosy. It's no coincidence that the Hebrew word metzora, leper, is interpreted by the rabbis as motzi shem ra, one who spreads a bad reputation. Miriam, by speaking about the Cushite woman, had technically committed this sin, and the punishment was the one the law prescribed. But there is a fourth explanation, more uncomfortable, more political, more historically disturbing, and once you hear it, you will never read the book of Numbers the same way again. Miriam was punished because she was a woman who dared to challenge male authority. In a patriarchal society, a woman who speaks publicly against the male leader constitutes a threat to the entire social order. The punishment of Miriam, according to this reading, is not only divine, it is social. It is a warning for every woman in Israel. No matter how great your charisma, no matter how strong your spiritual authority, no matter that you have been recognized as a prophetess directly by God, if you challenge the constituted male authority, you will be destroyed. This reading is painful, but it's nearly impossible to dismiss, because after Hazeroth, Miriam falls silent for the rest of Scripture. She never leads another dance. She never prophesies again. She never intervenes in the controversies of the people. Her voice, which had been the voice of the women of Israel, is surgically removed from the narrative. And when she returns, only once, it is only to die. But the traditional reading, the one taught in religious schools, tends to flatten Miriam into the rebellious sister, the slanderer, the woman who dared to challenge and was rightly punished. If you allow yourself to hear the voices the biblical narrator has silenced, a much more complex portrait emerges. When Miriam speaks against Moses, she says literally, "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken also through us?" This is not empty rhetoric. It is a claim of legitimacy. She is saying, "I am a prophetess. I have received the word of God. I have religious authority. Why should Moses be the only one who decides?" And remember, the initial criticism concerned the Cushite woman. One possible reading is that this foreign woman was being mistreated by the community, and Miriam was defending her. If that's the case, her intervention wasn't gossip. It was an act of solidarity. A prophetess raising her voice to defend a woman without a voice. And the punishment becomes even more tragic. A woman silenced for having spoken for another woman. Or perhaps Miriam was exercising her legitimate prophetic authority to correct what she saw as a problematic decision by Moses. Perhaps she believed the situation with the Cushite woman was genuinely wrong, and as a prophetess felt the duty to say so. That's exactly what the prophets in the Book of Kings do when they criticize the kings. Prophets speak against the rulers. That is their role. So why, when a woman does it, is she punished? The Book of Numbers does not answer this question. It leaves it suspended, hidden behind the cloud of the tent of meeting. But it has tormented readers for millennia. In the years after Hazeroth, during Miriam's long silence, the people of Israel continued their journey. Moses sent 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. 10 returned terrified, saying the land was full of giants. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, said God would give them victory. The people wept all night. They wanted to return to Egypt, and God decreed that entire generation would die in the wilderness. They would wander for 40 years until every rebel had perished. Where was Miriam during all of this? The text doesn't say. She was probably almost 90 years old by then, walking through the desert with the women, probably still respected, still loved, but mute, without a public voice. Then came the rebellion of Korah. He was a cousin of Moses and Aaron from the same tribe of Levi. He rose up with 250 leaders and made an accusation almost identical to Miriam's at Hazeroth. "You take too much authority for yourselves. The whole community is holy. Why do you set yourselves above us?" The earth opened beneath Korah's feet. It swallowed him, his family, his supporters. Fire from God consumed the 250 leaders. A total annihilation. Miriam was there. She saw the fire. She heard the earth crack open. She watched hundreds of people die in seconds for saying essentially the same thing she had said years before. And perhaps in that moment, she understood how fortunate she had been. She had received leprosy for 7 days. She had survived. She had been healed. Korah and his followers had been erased from the face of the earth. Perhaps this is why Miriam chose silence after Hazeroth, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had seen firsthand how thin the line was between legitimate prophecy and rebellion, and she chose, for the good of the people, to remain quiet. Or perhaps her voice was simply taken from her. We don't know. The text does not say. The journey of Israel continued, year after year, camp after camp. The generation of the Exodus began to die. The elderly leaders, the men who had witnessed the plagues of Egypt, the women who had danced at the Red Sea, falling one by one, buried in the desert sand. And Miriam was growing old. She kept walking. She kept carrying her tambourine through the dry desert wind. The younger women looked at her with reverence. She was a living legend. She had seen the banks of the Nile. She had saved Moses from the water. She had led the song of liberation. Even though she no longer spoke publicly, her presence was sacred. She was the living memory of everything her people had survived. Then they arrived at the wilderness of Zin, at Kadesh, and there, at the beginning of the first month of the 40th year, after the exodus from Egypt, the prophetess of Israel closed her eyes for the last time. The rabbinic tradition says Miriam died with a kiss, literally. In Hebrew, they say she died al pi Adonai, at the mouth of the Lord, the sweetest possible death. No pain, no struggle, no agony, the soul leaving the body, welcomed directly by God, the same death that, according to tradition, would be granted to Moses months later. It was the death reserved for the most righteous. And Miriam, despite the episode of the leprosy, despite the decades of silence, received that death. Because in the eyes of God, the sin of Hazeroth had been paid for. The punishment was complete, and Miriam, at the end, was still a righteous one, still the prophetess, still one of the 3 liberators God sent to bring his people out of slavery. When the well dried up the day after she died, and when Moses lost control and struck the rock, a terrible truth became clear. Miriam had not simply been the sister of Moses, she had been his balance, his other half. The female voice of liberation. Without her, even Moses fell. There is one final connection that runs through the centuries and reaches all the way to the New Testament. The name Miriam, in Hebrew, is exactly the same name as another biblical figure, a woman who, 1400 years later, in a small village of Galilee, would receive the announcement of an angel. A woman who would give birth to a child destined to save the world. In Greek, she would be called Miriam, in Latin Maria, in English Mary. The mother of Jesus. The name is identical. Miriam the prophetess, sister of Moses. Miriam the mother of the Messiah. Both linked to the salvation of their people, both linked to sacred water. The first accompanies her people across the Red Sea. The second gives birth to the Son who would be baptized in the Jordan River and walk on the waters of Galilee. Both protagonists of famous songs. Miriam sings at the Red Sea. Mary sings the Magnificat. Both central female figures in the history of salvation, both often silenced, marginalized, pushed to the margins of their brothers' and sons' stories, but both absolutely indispensable. Many scholars have noticed this parallel. They've suggested that Mary of Nazareth consciously bears the name of Miriam the Prophetess, that her choice as the mother of the Messiah is deeply rooted in the Hebrew tradition of prophetic women, that the Magnificat is a direct echo of the Song of the Sea, and that Mary's suffering at the foot of the cross echoes Miriam's exile outside the camp, waiting for healing and readmission. This connection runs through millennia, and it reveals something that the surface reading of these texts often hides. Women in the scriptures form a chain of voices passed from one generation to the next. A chain that begins with Eve, continues with Sarah, manifests with Miriam, continues through Deborah and Huldah, explodes with Esther, and culminates with Mary. Women who sing, women who prophesy, women who save. Women who are often punished, marginalized, reduced to silence, but whose voices, despite everything, cross the centuries. So what does this story tell us about how the Bible treats women who dare to raise their voice? The answer is genuinely ambiguous. On one hand, the Bible remembers Miriam. It names her. It gives her the title of prophetess, an official recognition. It allows her to lead a sacred song that survived 3 millennia. It describes her as one of 3 liberators sent by God. The prophet Micah names her alongside Moses and Aaron. On the other hand, the same Bible punishes her with leprosy in front of everyone. It exiles her for 7 days. It strips her voice from the narrative. It gives her 1 line at death, while Aaron receives 11 verses and Moses an entire chapter. It turns her into a warning. Miriam is the prototype of every biblical woman who raises her voice, from Deborah, who judges Israel, to Huldah, who prophesies in the temple, to Esther, who saves her people, to Mary, who births the Messiah. All have authority. All are recognized, but all operate within boundaries. And when a woman steps outside those boundaries, as Miriam did at Hazeroth, the consequences are devastating. But there is something that gets lost in the controversy. Miriam was saved, not destroyed, not erased, not eliminated. Punished, yes. Silenced, yes. But in the end, healed, readmitted, mourned in silence by the people who loved her, and remembered forever. And when the well dried up the day after her death, it was the definitive proof. For 40 years, Israel drank water because of a woman. For 40 years, the physical survival of the entire nation depended on her presence. Only after she died did everyone understand how fundamental she had been. How much Israel owed her every single day for its own survival. Women in the Bible are often silenced, often punished, often marginalized, but their hidden work, their unrecognized presence, their silent contribution holds up everything. Without Miriam saving Moses from the Nile, no Exodus. Without Miriam leading the song at the Red Sea, no celebration of liberation. Without the well of Miriam, no survival in the wilderness. This is Miriam, the prophetess who challenged Moses and lost her skin, but who, in the end, won eternity. Because every time we read the Exodus, every time we hear the Song of the Sea, every time we remember the liberation of Israel from Egypt, her name returns. Her tambourine still sounds across the centuries. Her voice, even though silenced in the text, refuses to disappear. And the wilderness of Zin, where she rests beneath the desert sand, is not just a tomb. It is a monument to a woman who dared to speak when women were expected to stay silent. A woman who paid the price, but who, in the end, was righteous. If this story has changed the way you read the Bible, if you've wondered what else has been told only halfway, what other voices have been silenced, what other stories are waiting to be uncovered, stay with us. Because There are other Miriams in the scriptures, other women whose silence hides something immense, other voices that deserve to be heard. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And the next story you discover will change forever the way you read these ancient pages.